Good morning. Welcome to Ocean Conservancy's first Google Hangout. My name's George Leonard, and I'm Chief Scientist for the organization. I'm going to be moderating our conversation today. We're here to talk about marine debris and trash in the ocean and how it impacts the health of our oceans. Many of you know that the issue was really brought to the fore relatively recently when the Malaysian flight 370 was lost on March 8th over the Indian Ocean, and a number of false alarms associated with the floating debris that was hampering that search. Well, this morning, Ocean Conservancy released its annual accounting of marine debris found around the world on beaches and waterways. And as you're going to hear, the numbers are pretty staggering, and they highlight that marine debris, and especially plastics in the ocean, is a persistent and it's really a growing problem that all of us in society need to tackle. We've got a great panel here today who can provide some insights into the scale of the problem and what we really need to do to address it. Let me give you a few specifics on how this is going to work. The Hangout will last for about 30 minutes. You can submit your questions via Twitter using the hashtag, let me get this right, TrashFreeOC. And you can also submit your questions on the chat window up in the upper left-hand corner here in the Google Hangout window. We're going to collect those questions, and we'll try to pose as many of those to the panelists as we can after I ask them a few questions. Let me just quickly introduce our panelists. First, we've got Nick Mallis. He's marine debris specialist here at Ocean Conservancy. He's traveled around the world studying marine debris, including expeditions to Alaska and Japan following the tsunami there. And Nick really heads up our efforts to curate the world's largest database of marine debris information during Ocean Conservancy's International Cleanup, which happens each September. We've also got Dr. Chelsea Rockman, who's a postdoctoral scholar at the University of California in Davis. She's in California. I'm in California as well. And Nick and our third panelist, Ted, are on the East Coast. Chelsea has formal training in the field of ecotoxicology, and she's published extensively on the impact of plastic on ocean health. And her work is really sort of cutting edge in providing new insights into the scale and the scope of marine plastic pollution. Our third panelist is Ted Siegler. He's a principal at DSM Environmental, which is a waste management consulting firm. And Ted, while he lives in Vermont, has spent much of his life traveling around the world improving waste management infrastructure in a whole host of countries. And that experience has really sort of positioned him in a really unique way to identify what really needs to be done to tackle this problem. So let's get started. We'll start with Nick, and I have a couple of questions for you today, Nick. First, can you quickly give us a definition of what marine debris is, and how does that differ from this issue of plastic pollution, which we often hear a lot about in the news?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, George. So marine debris is essentially a term that addresses all human-derived debris or trash that ends up in our ocean, on our beaches, or in our waterways. And there's an official definition through NOAA, but essentially what it is, it's these items ranging from bottle caps to tires to fishing nets all fit under the umbrella that is marine debris. When we think about marine or plastic pollution, though, it's not just about plastic that's in the ocean. We're talking about the entire life cycle of plastic, starting at the very top when it's made as these little resin pellets, all the way down to its end-of-life fate, which all too often is the ocean. So along this entire pollution vector, there are myriad places where these plastics can escape into the environment.
Great. So essentially, plastic is a subset of marine debris. And as I mentioned at the top of the hour, Ocean Conservancy has released its data report today, and you've headed up that work. Can you give us a sense of what the scale of the International Coastal Cleanup really is, and in particular, what some of the key findings are in this year's report?
Well, first and foremost, once again, the volunteer effort was truly remarkable. Nearly 650,000 volunteers in 92 countries around the world turned out to clean their local waterway or their beach. And unfortunately, though, 2013 was no different than prior years, as there was plenty of trash to pick up. And in fact, volunteers picked up more items during last year's cleanup than ever before in the 28-year history of the cleanup. And what's clearly evident from the 13 million items of trash that were picked up is that plastics dominate. The top 8 items found were all made of plastic, and in total, plastics accounted for about 85% of all the debris collected.
Wow. That's a pretty staggering number. So we've collected here at Ocean Conservancy data from the coastal cleanup for a number of years, almost 30 years. Can that information tell us anything about whether this problem is getting worse or better, or is it pretty much staying the same?
What we can definitely say, George, is that the problem is not going away. For 25 years now, if we look at the data, we see that the abundance of trash collected is strongly correlated with volunteer effort. However, we've yet to see a year where we hit a ceiling and where diminishing trash occurs. And similarly, if we look at the scientific literature, we know that studies have shown plastics in the oceans have increased by 2 orders of magnitude over the past 4 decades. So taking these pieces of evidence combined, we can say with confidence that our ocean trash problem is certainly increasing.
Great. Well, we're not so great, but we're over 500,000 people come out every fall for the International Coastal Cleanup. Of course, we share the planet with almost 7 billion others. This is obviously a big and daunting problem. So from where you sit, what's kind of the role of individual behavior and individual choice in the context of what clearly is a global problem?
Well, I think simply put, we need to do better. It's really important to remember that this issue, this ocean trash problem, it's not an ocean problem, it's a people problem. And if we look, every year the top 10 list is populated with the same items we use in our daily lives. Plastic bags, utensils, beverage bottles, cigarette butts. These items are not only unnatural to our ocean, but they threaten wildlife, they threaten our economies, and they threaten our health and safety. And so as individuals, we have to start accepting responsibility and make a concerted effort to reduce our consumption of these disposable plastics and packaging, while simultaneously ensuring that any items we do use are properly disposed of.
Great. Thanks, Nick. I appreciate the insights into the data we've collected. Let's transition now to talk a little bit about the science of what we know about this issue. Chelsea, turning to you, as you heard from Nick, Ocean Conservancy's data clearly show there's a lot of trash out there, and most of that is plastic. As a scientist who has studied marine debris and plastics in particular, how concerned are you? How concerned should society be about what Ocean Conservancy documents each fall during the cleanup?
Well, what I would say is, you heard Nick say the problem's not going away. So the one thing that we do know is that plastic contaminates the oceans and habitats, even terrestrial habitats globally. And so there's no question that this material is in the environment. What I'm concerned is the impacts to organisms. And so we know that thousands of organisms and hundreds of species are affected by this debris. And this is either by entanglement or ingestion. And so we know that this can actually cause death to individual organisms. And in some of our, just to give an example of how widespread this problem is, this has been documented, ingestion or entanglement, all 7 species of sea turtles and about half of the species of cetaceans globally. So my concerns are really the interactions of this debris globally with our wildlife.
Right. So thank you, Chelsea. So without getting too technical here, tell me, what is it about the presence of plastics that pose a risk? If I typically think of plastic, I think of it as inert, right? We've heard about how plastic bottles sort of never go away. So if it's inert, what's the problem?
Right. So there's 2 sides to what's the problem. So there's the physical aspect, that even though it's inert, if it entangles an organism, it can kill an organism. If it gets caught in their gut and rips the stomach lining, same thing. We can see death to organisms from a physical, impact of that debris. But my particular interest is in the chemical side. And so plastics are made up of this cocktail of chemical ingredients, some of which we know are hazardous at certain concentrations. So there's ingredients such as bisphenol A and phthalates that we hear about as being potentially hazardous. And then plastics act like the sponge for all these other chemical pollutants that are already floating out there in aquatic habitats. And so what I've found is that when we look at that whole list of priority pollutants that the EPA has targeted as hazardous, persistent chemicals that shouldn't be in the ocean, 78% of those chemicals are actually associated with plastic debris, and a group of us actually reported this recently. And so my main concern is really this cocktail of chemicals that can transfer to an animal when they do ingest it.
Great. Thank you for a non-technical explanation of what's clearly a technical issue. I'm familiar, of course, with some of the scientific literature as well. if we think about, there's a range of sort of small creatures that people don't think about a lot that where there's evidence that this is a problem. But most people's association with the ocean is through fish and through seafood. So can you give us a sense, given that 1 billion people rely on wild-caught seafood as a food source, for how big a threat the issue of plastic poses to our seafood supply, and what the sort of state of knowledge of that is?
Yeah, no, this really is the question we need to understand is what does this mean for humans? So this is twofold, right? So if plastics are indeed disrupting a population, it could potentially be declining our seafood. We don't know. The real ecological impacts of marine debris, we're really still trying to figure this out. How does plastic affect populations? The other side of this is the chemical aspect. So in our laboratory, we did a study where we fed fish, because fish is what we think about as seafood, plastic that had been exposed to the marine environment. And we saw that those chemicals on the plastic do indeed transfer from the plastic to the fish. And we know that fish that we ingest, we eat, tuna, we eat yellowtail, these have been documented to have plastic in their stomach. So we really do need to look at, particularly at seafood, what's the concentration of plastic in their gut, and does this seem to be correlated with the amount of contaminants in their body burden? And this really is, I think, the next big issue in research that we need to tackle.
Great. So is it fair to say that this question of seafood toxicity and plastic is kind of a cutting edge, or the cutting edge of the research field right now?
Yeah, the National Academy just held a meeting less than a month ago to figure out what is the state of the science. And this was the EPA put together this meeting to say, what do we know about human health in plastics? And I think that's really the big question that we can use to drive policy changes.
Okay. Great. Thank you, Chelsea. So, Ted, let's transition to you. We'll move from sort of the science of what we know about plastics in the ocean to sort of what can we do about this. And as I've indicated, you've worked for 30 years on garbage on land. What's the relationship between how society manages its waste and this question of marine debris in the ocean and impacts on wildlife?
Thanks, George. As Nick said earlier, if you look at the list of the most common materials that you find in the coastal cleanup, they're almost all land-based plastic waste. They're not fishing debris or other material perhaps discharged from ships, although that is also occurring. When I started working in developing countries 30 years ago, there was almost no plastic in the waste stream, and now it's the dominant material in the waste stream. And unfortunately, the infrastructure to manage that material has not kept up. So as a consequence, we're constantly struggling to get trucks, find disposal capacity just to get waste off the streets in many countries. And much of this is plastic waste, and it can easily find its way to rivers and to wetlands and ultimately to the marine environment.
Okay. So is it fair to say that maybe this is going to sort of this will solve itself? That is plastic production sort of in a trajectory where if we just kind of sit back, somehow society will figure this out? What's the trajectory of the production of these kinds of materials that find their way into the ocean?
Well, ironically, the amount of plastic being produced each year is growing even faster than world population, which is growing fairly quickly by itself. And so we have an increasing problem, not a decreasing problem. And in much of the world outside of the developed countries, the funding for the infrastructure to manage it simply isn't there. We have countries where you can't educate kids after the 3rd or 4th grade, where you don't have a sewer system, where you don't have good drinking water supplies. And so focusing on getting the garbage off the streets, while it's very important to the people in the countries that we work in, it is often down the list in terms of the ability of governments to solve the problem. So we have a growing problem, not a diminishing problem.
Okay. So while you've been talking, Ted, we've been fielding questions that are coming in over the web, and I've got one here that's kind of related to this. It's the flip side of waste management, which is the question of recycling. And the question comes from Amanda Jennings. It says, most towns I've lived in don't have recycling bins for every suburb. It's then left to the average citizen to bring recyclables to a center. which could be very far away. Do you think the first step to Ocean Conservancy is to provide every person recycling bins? So can you talk a little bit about how recycling relates to waste management and to what extent that sort of solves the marine debris problem?
Recycling is obviously really important from an environmental point of view, but unfortunately, while many people think that the answer is to simply recycle more of this material, and that is one of the answers, the reality is that in much of the world, there is an informal sector who is collecting material that has enough value for them to collect it and bring it to someone who can process it. Unfortunately, plastic is so lightweight that even though it has value, in many cases the infrastructure doesn't exist or the value isn't great enough to collect this material and make a living wage. We've done a lot of work, for example, in South Africa looking at what it takes for an informal sector collector to get enough money during the course of the day to feed himself or herself that night, and you can rarely do that on plastic. So in the developing world, we really have to go back to where we were in the United States 40 or 50 years ago and say this is an infrastructure problem. We need to collect the material off the street first, and then we need to develop the markets for the material. So yes, in the United States, recycling is really important. We're doing a lot of work now in public space recycling, putting out recycling bins wherever people are, and to get the message out that it's a resource that should be collected. But it by itself is not going to be sufficient to solve this problem.
Great, thanks. So one other question, Ted, and then I've got a couple others here that I'll pose to the group. If I think about waste management in my town in Santa Cruz, my taxes go to garbage collection and recycling. What do you see as the relative responsibility of sort of citizens and taxpayers who consume these products that often end up in the ocean versus the companies that manufacture them, that sell them to us? What's the relative importance of the private sector and the public sector in terms of driving for solutions to this marine debris problem?
I think that it ought to be a shared responsibility between the two. Unfortunately, in much of the world, almost all of the responsibility comes back to the citizens and to the municipal and state governments. And I think that this is an area that if we really are going to solve this problem, if we're going to raise funds to solve this problem, we really need to look to the resin producers and the plastic producers to step up and fund some of the infrastructure associated with managing this material, both as solid waste and in sewer outlets and wastewater outlets, any area where it can be discharged into the marine environment or a lake or a river environment. And so I think so far it's been somewhat unbalanced, where perhaps 80 or 90% of the cost is paid by 1/2 of the people that have a responsibility here, and that is something that really does need to change.
Okay, great. Thanks for that concept, Ted. So a question has rolled in again while you've been talking. I'm going to send this back to you, Nick. Ocean Conservancy does a lot of work in Washington, D.C., where you are, and we spend a lot of time talking to our elected officials. The question is, isn't existing data enough for policy change? What is the response of politicians at various levels to the issue of plastic pollution?
It's a great question. I think it's a timely one. If we look at the United States specifically right now, there's a lot of movement taking place in the policy realm. California has really been leading the way for the past 5 to 10 years, looking at bag bans and product-specific legislation. And just over the past few months, we're starting to see bans of microbeads, of these small, minute plastic pieces that are used in facial soaps and other cleansers have been banned from several states. And so we're starting to see a shift in the recognition that there are some materials, some products out there that we just do not need as society, and there are suitable alternatives for those materials. So I do think the data that have been collected, the literature, the evidence that is out there of the impacts that shows that this is a real concern in the marine environment. The body of knowledge is there, action is starting to be taken, and we are seeing more and more policymakers, both at the state level but also at the federal level, starting to show real interest in how we can systematically reduce these materials from entering the marine environment in the first place.
Okay, super. So Chelsea, let me send one over to you. Again, just came in off the web here. Picks up a little bit on this question of microbeads, which is in the news. And the question is, what is the current ratio of plankton to plastic in the ocean? I'm thinking of the microbeads as part of the overall plastic that's in the ocean. And is there a ranking of the most polluted oceans and the least polluted oceans? Do you have a sense of that from where you sit from the science perspective?
To be honest, that's a loaded question. We don't know the ratio of plastic to plankton in the ocean, and I would like to argue it does not matter. I don't think that's a calculation that's going to tell us whether or not we need to do something. I think that there's a lot of information out there showing that, yes, there's a lot of microplastic coming up in our nets when we're out sampling in the middle of ocean gyres. But I think that question alludes to, like, to be asking, where's our biggest problem? Because if we can find out where it's more contaminated, maybe that's where we go in and do mitigation. And I challenge people to think about the coasts, especially here. We're talking about coastal cleanup as opposed to, the gyres are really important. Yes, there's a lot of plastic in them, but I think it's a sexy topic, whereas I think we all know every beach we go to has plastic on it. And if we focus on the coasts, especially where we get our resources, our seafood, etc., I think we might find some of the most polluted spots right there.
Okay.
Yeah, and George, if you don't mind, I'd like to jump in there and build on something that I think is really important that Chelsea said is, it's not necessarily thinking about the gyres. It's looking, inland. It's looking at our coasts and our beaches. But I would say it's even one step further that we also need to look inland. So if we look at the International Coastal Cleanup, it's not just events taking place on beaches or on the coast. There are cleanups that take place hundreds of miles inland on rivers and lakes and creeks. And far too often, these are the out-of-sight, out-of-mind places where illegal dumping takes place. You find mattresses, you find refrigerators that may have toxic, fluids in them. So this is not just a problem that is plaguing our beaches, that is plaguing our marine ecosystems. It's also an issue that is very much threatening our inland and freshwater ecosystems as well.
Great. So let me stay with you, Nick, for a second. Again, another question rolling in from Jim Rice. That relates to this fundamental question of awareness, particularly in places that are away from the ocean. So the question is, how can we get plastic awareness curriculum into schools nationwide to teach the next generation of leaders how to be the solution to the issue of plastic pollution? So do we have ideas on how we can sort of raise awareness broadly in schools on this issue?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, one of the most powerful things you can do is actually take your students or take your children out onto the beach to participate in a cleanup. Certainly, as I think you've alluded to, George, the cleanups themselves are not the solution to this issue, but they are a transformative experience. And many times, the act of picking trash up off the beach, out of the waterway, is the first time that we as individuals really think about this problem. From the curriculum standpoint, however, Ocean Conservancy is just completing a curriculum geared specifically for school children called Talking Trash. And it was funded in concert with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, and we are in the final stages of disseminating those materials and information to teachers and parents alike around the country. So we are making those materials available to do the very things that asked.
Great, Ted. I got a note from you you wanted to add to Nick's comments. Feel free to do so.
Yes, for those of you listening in the U.S., Vermont is famous for having a Green Up Day the first Saturday in May every year. We've been doing it for 40 years, and every municipality has a coordinator, Green Up coordinator, which I am in my municipality, and we involve all of the school children in going out and collecting trash along the sides of the road on that day, and I go into the school a couple days in advance when we're assigning road segments to these students. And this year I started talking about marine plastic, and according to the teachers, the rest of the day the students were phenomenally interested in the whole concept of what was happening in the marine environment and what the impact of plastics were. And as you know, Vermont doesn't have a coastline. We're a long way from the coast, but we have a lot of rivers and lakes, and so there's a great deal of interest at the student level. I would say there's lots of interest at every level. Everyone, I think, adults and students, all recognize that this shouldn't be occurring, but it is occurring, and it's a growing problem, not a diminishing one.
Great, thanks for that. Let's transition back to another science question we've got. And the question here, and I'll send this to you, Nick, to start with, because at Ocean Conservancy I know we're doing some work with sea turtles. The question is, are there statistics from necropsies, that is when you evaluate dead animals, on turtles that give a percentage of plastic found inside the turtles and where in the animal is the material found? A rather technical question. I would broaden that out to a little bit to think about sort of how important is this issue of plastic pollution to turtles?
Yeah, it's a great question. I will broaden that out. And so I can't speak specifically on the statistics or the exact numbers, but what I can say is that as an individual, having done necropsies on sea turtles on several species, every turtle I've ever performed a necropsy on has had plastics in its gut. And I think more powerful, or a more poignant statistic is that some of my colleagues who work as state sea turtle biologists in the southeast will tell you that almost every turtle they find washed ashore and perform necropsies on have some form of synthetic material in their GI tract, most often plastic. So it is certainly a problem. We know it poses very real threats and impacts to those organisms, but it's not just plastics themselves. We also know that items like balloons are particularly problematic to sea turtles because they resemble some of their primary prey items. So when we look at these data, it's very important not to just look at the sheer abundance of what we're finding out there on the beaches, because items like balloons are less than 1% of all the items we find. It's also very important to think about what is the ecological threat associated with each of those items that we find on the beach as well.
Okay, thanks for those insights. Chelsea, do you have any other insights into the plastic issue from a science perspective on sea turtles, the kinds of mechanisms you've studied with toxin transfer? Is that an issue for those kinds of animals as well?
So when it comes to toxin transfer, I mean, I would imagine, yes, it is an issue. The problem with charismatic megafauna is it's very hard to get samples to actually analyze the contaminants in them, although I do have a friend that takes blood samples from live turtles, and if you have a necropsy, I imagine you can take tissue. Most of the work in contaminant transfer has been done in the lab, though, with fish and smaller organisms. But I will say, from scouring the literature on plastic debris in sea turtles, is that there are papers that show that, you know, this contamination that Nick talks about, that's very common, that it can indeed cause death. And so sometimes they find at the end of the necropsy that death was caused from the ingestion of plastic debris or entanglement of plastic debris. Okay,
great. Thanks for that. So we're getting close to the end of the Hangout. I want to ask one question to each of the three of you. And, you know, you represent a range of perspectives, right? Nick, you work in the conservation field. Chelsea, you're a scientist. Ted, you're a waste management person. But you're all kind of individuals at the same time, right? So the question is, and let's start with you, Ted, but it's the same question to everybody, which is, what is the one small thing that everybody can do to help fix this problem in the ocean? And you can only say one thing.
That's a hard one, George.
Yeah, well, we're ending on a hard question, Ted.
I think that everyone needs to recognize that plastic packaging, plastics are here to stay, and that we need to manage them wisely, and we need to really step up our efforts to make sure that the plastics that we use, that comes into our daily life, are recycled and managed correctly.
Perfect. Chelsea, let's go to you. One thing that everybody needs to do to fix this problem.
Well, I would go back to the think about coastal places or your local area. I would say, yes, this is a global problem, but it has a local solution. So here people have power. So think about your own waste management system in your own town or your own bans in your own city, and push for local mitigation.
Great. So perfect example of think globally, act locally. Nick, you get the last word on the same question.
All right. I think it's information, and as Ted showed, you know, speaking to people about this issue can create a whole new awareness that never existed. And for people to make the right decisions, they have to be informed. And we need to do that by teaching people, though, not by preaching to people. And I think at times we have been our own worst enemy in the conservation field for being critical or negative of issues. So I think we need to provide people the information, make them aware of what's going on out there, and then allow them to make the right decisions and stem this issue at its source.
Perfect. I'll put my vote in for that one as well. So that's a wrap. We're pretty much out of time. I want to give a special thanks to our three speakers. Ted and Nick and Chelsea, in particular for taking the time out of your day. I know you're all busy to join us on the Google Hangout. If you've missed any of this, you can watch it again. You can go to Ocean Conservancy's Google Plus page, or you can also find this on YouTube. I would remind everybody that Ocean Conservancy today released its 2014 data report, and you can find that and a whole bunch of other information associated with marine debris on our website. Go to oceanconservancy.org, and with that, I'll sign off today. Thank you.